Hello everyone. I believe we have everyone joining in, but it's 5 o'clock, and so I wanted to bring you in and get started talking about Bushwick Inlet Park. Again, thank you for joining, and I want to welcome you to the second iteration of the North Brooklyn Parks Alliance panel series, which we're focusing on the future of public space. My name is Katie Denny Horowitz, and I'm the Executive Director of the North Brooklyn Parks Alliance. And we are a public-private partnership that was founded in 2003 to work toward creating a more accessible, equitable, and vibrant park system throughout North Brooklyn. This fall in particular, as many organizations across the city are doing, we're kind of moving to a virtual format, and we've been focusing on these virtual panels on different infrastructure projects and the impact that those projects might have in light of the global and fiscal health crises that we are all facing. Last month, we looked at the Under the K Bridge Park, which is a new 7-acre space that my organization has partnered with New York State on. It's underneath the Kosciuszko Bridge in Greenpoint, and we completed construction over the summer. And next month, we're going to focus on BQGreen, a space above the BQE, which is a really ambitious concept to deck over a portion of the BQE in light of some of the environmental injustices that the south side of Williamsburg have seen historically. And so those two projects, the Under the K Bridge Park and the BQGreen, really use transportation infrastructure as an intersection of parks and infrastructure of a city. And it's interesting, a few weeks ago when we put together the series focusing on infrastructure, someone asked me, well, why Bushwick Inlet Park? It's not really connected to an infrastructure project. And so the answer was really that, as far as we're concerned at the North Brooklyn Parks Alliance, as well as I think all the partners here and many of you attending and listening in tonight, is that we really feel that parks are essential to cities and that they're not a luxury, but that they are an essential integrated fabric of an urban environment, and just as important and critical as transportation, as utilities. And I think that our community has felt this way for decades, which is why the creation of open space has been really at the forefront of our community advocacy and stewardship for many decades. And certainly when Bushwick Inlet Park was envisioned and planned out as part of the 2005 rezoning. And so we've asked a good friend of ours, our local historian, Ward Dennis, who also happens to be on my board, and he's on the steering committee of the Friends of Bushwick Inlet Park, to give us a little history of the 27-acre park that many of you are probably familiar with, but maybe some of you aren't familiar with the history and the status of the park. So I wanted to share that story.
Bushwick Inlet Park is a 27-acre piece of land that sits along the East River at the juncture of Greenpoint and Williamsburg. The park was officially designated in 2005, a giveback from the City of New York to the community as part of a massive rezoning that has so far added more than 50,000 new residents. The design of the park is guided by a master plan developed through a community process in 2007. When it is completed, Bushwick Inlet Park will be a crown jewel in the midst of 5 miles of waterfront esplanades from the Navy Yard to Newtown Creek. But 15 years after the rezoning, this park is still more of a concept than a reality. As of 2020, less than a quarter of the promised park has been opened. 400 years ago, Bushwick Inlet Park was mostly underwater. The area above the high water line was a low-sloping sandy beach. Bushwick Inlet, now a small cove on the East River, was the mouth of a vast inland waterway that included wetlands covering all of McCarran Park. Bushwick Creek was part of a rich and fertile wetlands that had supported the indigenous population for centuries. the summer home of the Keshkakog clan of the Canarsie tribe. For almost 200 years, the area existed as a small farming community. Only a few hundred people occupied the entire town of Bushwick, over a third of them enslaved blacks. But in the early part of the 19th century, Williamsburg and then Greenpoint began to transform into urban landscapes dominated by heavy industry. One such enterprise was Continental Iron Works. In 1862, Continental launched the ironclad warship USS Monitor from the foot of Collier Street. Today, the Greenpoint Monitor Museum occupies the north side of the inlet on land donated to it by the Motiva Corporation. The museum sits next to the northernmost piece of Bushwick Inlet Park. The community recently approved a plan to construct a 3-acre passive open space overlooking the inlet here. Funding for this parcel has been allocated and construction is expected to begin in early 2021. On the south side of Bushwick Inlet, Charles Pratt's Astral Oil kerosene distillery was founded just before the Civil War. Pratt's legacy lives on in many ways, but at Bushwick Inlet it lives on in the severe contamination that lies under the site. Now called the Bayside parcel, 7.5 acres in total, it was acquired by the city in 2015 and is currently undergoing testing. The parcel will need to be remediated before design and construction can be undertaken. None of this work is currently funded. Another major source of contamination at the inlet was manufactured coal tar gas. The now lush lawn at 50 Kent once housed massive gas holding tanks for the Williamsburg Gaslight Company, resulting in contamination that extended more than 25 feet below ground. 50 Kent was remediated in 2017, and in 2018 the Parks Department approved a design for this parcel. Construction is funded and expected to start in early 2021. The two southern blocks of BIP sit atop a former rail yard, the Brooklyn Eastern District Terminal. The 25-acre freight terminal was operational until the 1980s, after which it became an ersatz playground and park. The South Terminal block contains the only part of Bushwick Inlet Park that is operational, a soccer field constructed in 2010 and a community house built in 2013. North of that, and also once part of the rail terminal, is the massive blue and white city storage building. It was the last piece of Bushwick Inlet Park to be acquired. Today, the building is vacant, awaiting funds for demolition, remediation, design, and construction. Bushwick Inlet Park is also the legacy of community action. As industry faded in the post-World War II era, local activists began fighting to reclaim the waterfront for the community. In the late 1980s, the North Brooklyn community had organized to develop a community-based plan to transform Williamsburg and Greenpoint into mixed-use communities centered around public access to the waterfront. In the early 2000s, the Bloomberg administration envisioned Bushwick Inlet Park as part of an Olympic Village. NYC 2012 did not pan out, but out of that planning came the 2005 Bloomberg proposal to rezone 186 blocks of the waterfront for residential use. But this 2005 rezoning did not create a park. The land was still in private hands, residential construction quickly exploded, but parks construction did not keep pace. In 2007, Friends of Bushwick Inlet Park was organized and began a Where's Our Park campaign. In 2015, a fire destroyed part of the city storage facility. With the owner of the property threatening to sell out to the highest bidder, Friends of Bushwick Inlet Park, working with local residents, elected officials, North Brooklyn Parks Alliance, El Puente, and many other groups, ramped up its campaign. After almost 10 years of holdouts by the owner and inaction by the city, the property was finally acquired in 2016. With all of the pieces finally in place, the task now is building a park.
So thank you, Ward, for that overview, and also to Dewey Thompson, who helped with that, as well as Lynn Del Sol, who put it all together. So thank you. And that's what we're here to focus on, is the task at hand. And I think the park was a complicated project, as it were. I think that now, given the city and really the world's multiple crises happening, we wanted to take a moment to really reflect on what we've been able to do and what we can do moving forward. So with that, I want to welcome our panelists and our speakers. Regina Meyer is currently the president of the Downtown Brooklyn Partnership, but her experience in a similar park project is really exemplified with her work with Brooklyn Bridge Park, which she helped to build out and create and administer. Catherine Thompson is the co-chair of the Friends of Bushwick Inlet Park, which you heard a little bit about in the video if you don't already know them. They were critical in the acquisition of city storage, and they've continued to be incredibly active in advocating for the park as well as stewarding the completed portions. Adam Ganser recently became the executive director of New Yorkers for Parks, which is a more than 100-year-old organization that is also steeped in advocacy for parks. And prior to that, Adam was working for many years at the High Line. And so again, yet another, complicated, not waterfront, but close to the water park project. And Asima Jensfield has joined the High Line network, or it leads the High Line network, and we've gotten to know each other through our participation in that coalition, which brings together major park projects, not just here in the city, but also in the country and indeed the world. So we love to hear about some similar projects or lessons learned from those experiences. And I want to thank you all for joining us. I'd love for you all to have a conversation. Perhaps each of you could talk about your roles, and then we'll go into a Q&A. One thing before we do is a little bit of housekeeping. We have about 80 people joining us this evening. You only see the panelists on your screen. If you do want to ask a question, there's a Q&A button that you can press at the bottom of your screen. We'll be managing that Q&A process. You can also use the raise your hand function. If you don't want to type it out, we'd be happy to call on you and speak once we open up the questions to the attendees. So with that, I am going to hand it over, and thank you all for coming.
Okay, hi, I'm Regina Meyer. I'm president of the Downtown Brooklyn Partnership now, but I have had two roles in my career, which make me very interested in this topic, and I care very, very much about the Greenpoint Williamsburg waterfront. I led the rezoning for city planning in the Bloomberg administration for Williamsburg and Greenpoint as the director of the city planning office in Brooklyn. And after that, I had the incredible opportunity to build and bring online and finance Brooklyn Bridge Park, both of which were incredible experiences. But looking back to how much work, and obviously Ward's film was really, really fantastic, and I congratulate him for putting that together. It was really great. Is to talk a little bit about how the park proposal came to be, and for me, just seeing the emphasis on community activism in the 1990s was so key for how we got to where we are today. The two really incredible things to remember here that many of us don't remember anymore for great reason is that this entire waterfront was zoned for M3 heavy manufacturing. And in the 1990s, sadly, that meant that the highest and best use for private property was waste transfer stations. And the specter of having waste transfer stations line, especially the Williamsburg waterfront at the time, was horrifying to the community and really led them to fight for the waterfront. And that resulted in the 197A plans that were filed and approved by the city planning department. I can't overstate how important that effort was. It is entirely true that we would have seen waste transfer stations on the scale of ones that exist elsewhere in the city right on the waterfront. And when we had the opportunity to follow up at the city planning department on the 197A plans, the evolution from the reality of moving from M3 to mixed use development gave us the opportunity to really think about public access up and down the waterfront, all the way from the southern portion of the waterfront, which at that time was north of the Domino site, all the way to the Greenpoint lumber yards. All of those sites, 100% of them were privately held. The only public lands were the few park slivers at Greenpoint Avenue and an MTA site, a couple of small MTA sites. And this really, really set the stage for a lot of what's happened since. Obviously, it's a huge counterpoint to projects such as Brooklyn Bridge Park, where there was full public control from day one. And really was really an amazing process because, again, going back to the 1990s, the Parks Department had so much work to do in Williamsburg and Greenpoint. The Greenpoint Park at Greenpoint Avenue was barely usable. McCarran Park had many, many major deficiencies, which took years to both fund, design, and construct. And then, of course, it was our belief that there needed to be a great waterfront park at Bushwick Inlet. We were at that time, and then I'm going to turn this over because there's so much other great energy and background here on this panel. We were really happy that the state parks made that first important investment on the waterfront of those first 2 blocks. That was also privately held before state parks moved in and decided to take the lead there. And so really it was working with the city parks department after the state parks bought those first 2 blocks that we devised the remainder of the park plan.
Hi, everybody. So nice to be here talking about my favorite topic, Bushwick Inlet Park. I am co-chair of the Friends of Bushwick Inlet Park with Steve Chesler, and we have a steering committee that meets about once a month. And we talk about how can we make this park a reality. As you know, Ward's video explained, only a small portion of that is actually usable park. So our organization has a couple of parts to it. We do advocacy, and so we're always trying to work. We work with our elected officials. We meet with them. We talk about strategies for figuring out how to come up with. Number one is a long-term, capital funding plan. So there's been discussions, and this is kind of all pre-COVID, which has definitely thrown a wrench in a lot of everybody's plans. But the idea would be to create a long-term capital, almost like a bank account, where monies would be, accrued, and eventually there would be enough money, large sums, in order to design and build out the remaining parts of Bushwick Inlet Park. The Parks Department only designs park spaces after it's fully funded. So you have to get all the money up front. So there's that part. And another thing for advocacy wise we really work on is to demolish and get rid of that city storage building, which is a lot of money, but it's it's a first step. And we were given an amount of $16 million. And so, we have been advocating that be put into the council budget to be demolished. And then, but aside from that, since acquiring, all the parcels of land, we do have the Bushwick Inlet Park itself. And so there's lots of stuff to do there. And that's what we primarily focus in terms of programming and stewardship. So we write grants, we get money, we buy plants, we had community gardening design workshops, and then we get people coming down and planting and weeding and mulching. We've opened up the waterfront. We took down this big Parks Department fence, and now there's actually a beach. It's almost like an accidental beach that's emerged, and it's, people love it down there. And we've been doing educational coastal classroom workshops and stuff with kids and families. We have Billion Oyster Project, oysters that are growing in the inlet itself. We got a grant and built a dock, and now off the dock they're hanging these oyster cages. And so we partner with the North Brooklyn Community Boathouse and the Harbor School, and so we get a lot of stuff going on. In the winter we have art classes in the building itself. So and next summer, we were going to have it this summer, but next summer we're hoping we'll have some, music in the park. And so there's that. And one important thing is lately we've been advocating that the Parks Department repair the sort of main part of Bushwick Inlet Park is a soccer field that is pretty much used 24/7. And now it's ripped up. And we had a petition that we've delivered to the mayor and to the Parks Commissioner, Mitch Silver, and Borough Commissioner, Marty Marr, and we're just waiting for responses. We've been told that, money, everything is locked up in OMB. So, but I'm very interested in hearing about, we are activists. And so what can activists do to get the city to come up with, ideas of funding this enormous project that seems just untenable almost, but we hold out a lantern of hope.
So that's almost a perfect segue for Adam to hop on, because he's been doing analyses of the city's budget as it pertains to park projects. And so, Catherine, can you answer Catherine's question, or your thoughts about Catherine's question?
The last question, this is obviously a very complicated time with parks funding. I'll just briefly tell folks my little experience here. I started in, speak myself as a we, I started at New Yorkers for Parks about 6 months ago, and obviously right when COVID hit. And I think the budget crisis, both on the operating side and the freeze of capital funds, has been nothing short of devastating for this project and all the parks around the city. So that's been a real area of focus for us. One of the things that I quote quite a bit is some research that came from the Trust for Public Land, which is that at the beginning of this COVID pandemic and the closure of small playgrounds around the city, fully 1 million people, 1 million New Yorkers lost access to their only park and playground. And this area, which does not have a lot of parks, was pretty heavily impacted by that as well. So this is a real crisis. And in my opinion, this is a time to be doubling down on investment for parks. Obviously, the operating money isn't there right now, but for this specific park wouldn't be opening for a few years anyway. So right now seems like the perfect time to be pouring public resources into it, so that it's there when it needs to be in the future. As far as the city's budget, on the operating side, these statistics are pretty well known, so I'll repeat them anyway. The fiscal year this year, the Parks Department had a 14% budget cut, which for this Parks Department is devastating. The Parks Department has been underfunded for decades. One of the interesting things that I learned coming out of the Bloomberg years at the Highline into the de Blasio years is that, with each new park coming on, people want parks. So the Parks Department is saying yes, 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 but the parks budget is not reflected in the additional open spaces that are coming online. And so we're dealing with potentially more space, but the exact same amount of resources to maintain them. And that's just not sustainable. On the capital side, as you referred to, Catherine, your project is one of many. There's $1 billion right now stuck at OMB of parks projects. The majority of those are projects that are being managed by the Parks Department or EDC, but many of them are being managed by not-for-profit partner groups to the Parks Department, and they're all, they're just sitting there idle. And this to me feels absolutely ridiculous when we're all really needing to be in our public spaces, and that's going to be the way it is for the foreseeable future. So the only other thing I'll add is that the 10 years that I spent at the Highline, I got steeped in the considerable complications of working in public-private partnerships, working in rezoned area, working with developers, and it's not without some significant complications. But if an administration, the other thing I'd say there is, if an administration is behind a project and makes it a priority, it happens. And that's what happened with the Highline. It's what happened with several other parks during those years. And there's no reason why that couldn't happen here.
Well, we've got a lot of mayoral candidates that we can take them on tours of the Bushwick Inlet Park maybe. And
Absolutely.
So Seema, you've worked with Adam at the Highline, but then also you're working with other projects. So, what sort of innovative approaches to actually get those projects built have you seen?
Sure. Yeah. So as you mentioned, my name is Seema Jansfeld. I lead something called the Highline Network based out of the Highline in Manhattan. Adam was actually the steward of this group starting back in 2016 as a peer-to-peer learning community for other folks that were taking on infrastructure reuse across the US at that time. We've now got a couple of projects in Canada and Mexico as well, and projects running the gamut from fully established like Atlanta Beltline and the 606 in Chicago to those in construction like Waterloo, Greenway in Austin, and the Underline in Miami, and then folks who are right at the beginning of their journey in design and advocacy and thinking about their funding just as actively as Bushwick Inlet is right now. And the purpose of the network came organically out of folks reaching out to our founders about how did you go about with the fundraising, with the governance, with the advocacy, and really having members leverage the experience of each other to figure out how they can do their work better in serving their communities. And just like at Bushwick Inlet, we like to remind our members that this is really hard work. And for the Highline, from the idea to the first shovel in the ground, it did take 10 years, even with all of the political and the funding stars that aligned for that one to come together. And it took another 10 years for the full phases to be constructed. So they do take time. It takes a lot of community advocacy that's sustained over a long amount of time, and funding partners that are sustained over a long time as well. So, just in terms of looking at what I'm seeing in terms of trends for funding these large projects in other places, I'd say I see two larger concepts coming together. One being just the intersectionality of the benefits that parks provide. I think all of the panelists have touched on this, that it's not just about recreation and open space. It's key to the emotional and physical health of the communities that they serve. It provides all kinds of other benefits in terms of inclusivity and equity for and education opportunities, programming opportunities for the communities that they serve. And so we've seen folks leverage those benefits to identify fundings in perhaps non-traditional tracks for parks. So for example, and the environmental benefits, right? So we have a Houston project that was able to leverage their environmental and health benefits for a bond act at the state level. The 606 looking at as billing themselves as transportation alternatives. We've certainly seen that in New York as well to leverage federal funds. We have a project that we often turn to in DC called 11th Street Bridge Park, which is also still in design and advocacy, where they've raised over $50 million to support their organizational goals around equity before they've even put a shovel in the ground. So there are folks who are interested in funding parks in new and innovative ways if you're making the case and the story for them beyond just open space and recreation. The second kind of larger trend, I would say, probably also comes out of the lessons learned from the Highline experience. If you ask our founder what's his number one lesson learned about what he would do differently with the Highline, it would be around value capture and the fact that all of the value that was created in the Chelsea area with the rezoning, while it did benefit for the capital construction, nothing was allocated for operations and maintenance for the park. And I think a lot of folks don't know that the Highline does fundraise for its operations budget every single year anew. So that is an ongoing challenge. And I think that lesson learned is something that a lot of the network members have taken to heart in terms of when they're at the beginning of their journey for creating new spaces, like what are their opportunities to capture value in some creative way, either through the development that they anticipate occurring in the area, or more and more, how can they leverage funding to actually acquire land so that they actually benefit from the growth and the economic value that occurs, and that it can go back to community use or support of the park space. So, you know, we've seen lots of interesting ways for folks to think about that as well. Of course, there's all kinds of complications with that, because if you are tying yourself to economic value going up, that leads to gentrification and displacement issues if we see it in many places. And so that's a, you know, very frequent topic of conversation of how you balance the two so that you're actually supporting the community uses that you want to thrive from that growth, along with what that means for increased development in your area.
Cool, thank you. So I'm going to hand it over to Regina, who's going to just have a conversation with the panelists, and then we'll open it up to the audience.
Oh, that's great. That's great. I mean, I think that we have a lot of really great and interesting and important issues facing not just Bushwick Inlet, but the entire waterfront in New York City. And I think Adam really gave us a very, very sobering message about the state of the budget, which I think is really important for us to all take into account, given that we're still in the midst of a health crisis, and of course, still really haven't seen the sort of the true reckoning of what that will mean for the city and the state budget. But be that as it may, thank you, Adam. I wanted to talk really about community activism in a couple of dimensions, given my understanding of the initial activism in Greenpoint, Williamsburg, and now, of course, what Catherine is working, and Catherine and you, Katie, are working on so hard to continue the revitalization of the waterfront. My question really is, though, how hard was it to convince Mayor de Blasio to finally acquire the city storage site? And then, of course, what do you see on the day-to-day will be necessary moving forward?
Well, you know, I think our fight benefited from the fact that there was a timeline involved. You know, the city storage site went on sale. It was for sale, and they had, you know, then, and we knew that the owner wanted to unload it. And so he was either going to sell it to the city or he's going to sell it to another buyer. So there was this great sense of urgency. And I would say from an activism point of view that, you know, the sense of urgency, you know, propelled us forward to always think of more and more things to do and ways to activate and build our coalition. And so it was relentless activism. There was so many levels of activism that happened. And I would say we also benefited from a certain stroke of luck, because at that moment, Mayor de Blasio was rolling out his mandatory inclusionary housing and quality zoning, you know, Q something. And so he had mandated that this was going to get rolled out in every community board. There was going to be, you know, a presentation. So voila, we were able to use that as a platform and go to all the community boards where they were looking at rezonings and say, watch out, you know, they want this rezoning, but let us tell you our story about broken promises. And, you know, that went on, and, you know, soon the people from the mayor's office that had to deliver these messages to the community boards would see us coming, and they're like, oh, you know, here they come again. And that was on one level. And so it was this, but on the ground, you know, I think the first meeting happened where our council member, Steve Levin, said, look, we've got to have a press conference, and it's got to be in front of City Hall, and you have to get at least 100 people there at midday. And so it became a full-on, this is our first act. It was in March after the fire. And every week we would gather together and count how many activists we thought we could get there. And when the day finally came, we got 400. No, they couldn't even fit into that park. And that really set the stage for what was to come. And it was full of all sorts of crazy stunts. We had flash mobs. We slept out. We actually camped out on Kent Avenue with Eric L. Adams, the borough president, and Carolyn Maloney, our congressional representative, amongst so many others. And we had this big party. We had El Puente and their kids dancing. And then later we had a seminar about the history of the waterfront. Meanwhile, it started raining. We hung out. I mean, so talk about hard. It was relentless, but we had so many helpers. We had lawyers that were coming to help us. We got all the elected officials, and it became a thing. And it was very simple. And we had this deadline. Then Mayor de Blasio put $100 million on the table. And so there was all these, it was very dramatic. And so I would say that we were fortunate, and there was that timeline, and that we kept coming up with more schemes on how to, keep our activism in our community and involve everybody in it going. And I would say it's a little harder now. It's more vague. We have the whole park, and there's so many parks that need money. How come our park needs even more millions of dollars? Like what, I think it's tough. But it was really hard, but it was fun, and it was successful, and we were happy. And we're still excited about making it happen, but we don't have the same tools. The alignment isn't there, although to everybody's point, there is a mayor race coming up and a lot of turnover in our elected body. So we'll see what happens. I don't know.
I did want to talk a little bit about lessons learned both from Brooklyn Bridge Park and the High Line here, because I think, and I alluded to this a little bit in my comments when I started, was that the Brooklyn Bridge Park example is so different and has few parallels because of really two reasons. One, all of the property was always held publicly. There was never an issue where property had to be bought, but for one small property that Con Edison held. And the second thing that's so different about Brooklyn Bridge Park is that the park was approved with the mandate to self-finance, which actually, ironically, in this conversation, had the directly opposite result that you've had, Catherine, and that is that there was a huge amount of activism and litigation against Brooklyn Bridge Park because of our financial model. And our financial model essentially let Brooklyn Bridge Park be developed by assuring government, essentially, that we could raise the money to put hundreds of millions of dollars into waterfront infrastructure. The money from the development sites in Brooklyn Bridge Park is all being used now happily to rebuild all of the piers that the park sits on. And so that financial model, though, was the cause of a lot of community activism, but unfortunately it wasn't the happy kind of optimism and activism that you had, Catherine. That being said, there was always a great deal of support for Brooklyn Bridge Park in other parts of the community. And I think at this point in time, what the Brooklyn Bridge Park model has shown is that the value capture that we had was really within our own borders, right? There wasn't outside value capture. It was just using the properties that were designated for the project, not the park, to help finance it. But putting that aside, that example, Adam and Asima, do you want to talk a little bit about the incredible challenge that the High Line has?
Do you do this now?
I'd like you to take the honor as part of
Okay.
the birth story of the High Line.
Well, the rezoning of the High Line and West Chelsea, there was controversy around it, but certainly not what you faced, Regina. And I think that there was such a spirit around the vision of the High Line that once the idea that it wasn't impossible got out of the way, there was tremendous community support for it. And the High Line has grappled with the outcomes in West Chelsea for the last, call it 7 or 8 years, because the amount of development that happened and how quickly it happened, I think was certainly not what anybody had in their mind as the immediate future. But as far as community activism, both Robert and Josh, the co-founders of the High Line, were instrumental in getting people excited about an idea before there was any real vision behind the idea. I think that was the secret of it, is that you could go to a place and you could imagine what it would be for yourself. You didn't need a rendering. You didn't need anybody. It existed already in large part. And so that really, I think, was a big part of the success of the High Line in the early days. I think the Hudson Yards is a little bit of a different story. That last section was the last to be saved. It was slated for demolition, even into 2010, 2011. And it was a little bit harder for people to reconcile saving the High Line and a very large development that was going to be directly adjacent to it. Will forever be absolutely thankful that happened, because it's such an incredible juxtaposition between the High Line and the Hudson Yards. But I don't know how strongly the community felt about that last section in comparison to the first. There was really an effort to complete the High Line, but there was always some conflict with what was happening at the Hudson Yards. And I think the High Line probably benefited, frankly, from that juxtaposition. And ultimately, obviously, the park has been completed. Back to the value capture piece, that is what Asima was saying, is that is the great, failure is the wrong word, but that is one of the great missed opportunities, that the value, it was considered such a gamble. And now looking back, it seems like, why would you say that? Look at what's happened. But at the time, when I used to give these presentations, they were saying at best we'd get 500,000 people a year on the High Line, and now it's 8 million plus. So it's, time changes. You just can't predict what's going to happen, and everything's a negotiation.
I actually want to jump in with a question that in hearing both of you speak and something happening with Bushwick Inlet Park is the sort of the development over time. And you have these different sections kind of opening up. Regina, you with piers, and Adam, you with different spurs, right? And so, I think right now with Bushwick Inlet Park, so much money has already gone into it. And so we're at the point where additional money needs to go into it in order to realize the full picture. So were there moments along those different phases where you hit a sentiment of, oh, we've already put so much money into this, we can't do any more, or where the overall price tag was just difficult to swallow, either for the community or the public entities you were working with?
Yeah, I mean, for me, when I started at Brooklyn Bridge Park, we were barely funded. We had enough money to finish design and one pier and one playground. And I had to work with our government partners, which at that point was both the city and the state, and then that morphed to just the city, to make sure the remaining funds were allocated, which was really what I did most of the time. But I'd say a few different things about that. And interestingly, the Williamsburg Greenpoint experience both lapped that and followed it in a few different ways. We spent a lot of time in the first part of building Brooklyn Bridge Park to convince people that it was even usable and that it would be an asset to the community. It was such a foreign idea because the site had been so walled off from the community that people couldn't even imagine it. And so we actually tore a sheet off the Williamsburg playbook to convince people to come down by, for instance, bringing Smorgasbord down, which is something that actually, started up in Williamsburg. The idea of bringing that to Dumbo and to the waterfront was, to me, a Williamsburg idea we brought south. We also spent a huge amount of time convincing people that the waterfront would be fully accessible. And we did that by providing interim access and also a great deal of maps and narrative and communication on our website about the final vision of full waterfront access. And that was a huge, huge effort early on that we've all forgotten because the whole park is built out now. But there were times when people found it very, very hard to imagine. I think that Catherine, listening to your next challenge, I think that one of the real opportunities you have is to be creative about getting that vision out there, because there's a lot of ways to continually engage people, engage both community residents in the close term, but then of course the citywide audience in what that can be, how important the continuous access is, what that provides, and what that full vision is. So that really, to me, is sort of the answer there, Katie, is that there's a lot to do, but you've got to embrace the phasing in that way and be honest about it.
I was just going to add that I think we've seen that phasing, also to address what Catherine said earlier about how it was easier when there was a sense of urgency. I think when you have phasing and there's like these discrete portions or timelines that people can really digest, it's easier for you to fundraise in some ways, and then you can have a proof of concept while you continue to the next ones. So that in a way, you have an overall vision that you're presenting, but that there's digestible pieces that are easy to think about funding and occupying in a kind of shorter term, which is also why it's great that Bushwick Inlet has a part of it already built out, so you can already get to the waterfront in a place and really envision what it would feel like for all of it to be built out.
Well, it will be really exciting when the 50 Kent is built out, because part of the design is as you go on the edge of Kent Avenue, it's going to be actually a hill that they're going to put in there. I think it's like 12 or 15 feet. And so once you have this hill that slopes down, and you're going to be having this amazing view of city storage, which is that big, huge, blue and white aluminum building, which is going to be such a huge eyesore. I just can only imagine that they're going to want to tear it down right away as soon as they build that hill. But, and the momentum, I mean, we're all suffering from the momentum, this disruption and the crisis of COVID-19. And so I think it's going to be, that's part of it too. I mean, we would have been having 2 parcels kind of built out pretty soon, but those are going to be postponed, and so.
I have a quick question. Asima, we have talked, when Asima and I worked together, we were talking broadly about federal funding for these projects and how individual groups and stewards of these ideas can track down public fund or federal funding. Regina, you may know this better. Does the city in the current, we're in a very rough time right now, but there's all sorts of federal funding that is talked about. And if it's not going to be infrastructure week soon, I'm just going to write it off. But we have stimulus funding, infrastructure funding, transportation funding. And with the SEMA's group, a lot of those individual not-for-profit groups are looking for that type of funding. But does the city itself lobby for that type of funding? And does the city include parks projects like this, which could be considered critical infrastructure? And there's a couple of ways to talk about parks being infrastructure. There's the soft way, which parks are so important, they're infrastructure. And then there's the other way where the park is actually layered on infrastructure. And so it's really just a question, does the city of New York actively look for federal funding for different sectors?
Yeah, I haven't ever had the ability to raise federal funds at Brooklyn Bridge Park. But I would say the instances where federal funds have been used was post 9/11. LMDC did receive a specific amount of money that was used for open space improvements in Lower Manhattan and then also at Hudson River Park.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the real question there goes to our elected officials and our leadership about what the package does look like. Obviously,
exactly.
Today, right now, it's pretty hard to, to talk about because there are no details, obviously. But once we understand the scale of that, and obviously there's going to be huge need to our health network and our transportation system, right? I mean, you can't
MTA.
acknowledge that. But whether or not our local elected officials can work with our Washington counterparts to make a case for other needs. Like I said, in the case of the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation post 9/11, that was the case. So I think that's New York City's best and most recent example of an effective use of federal funds for open space.
Yeah, it makes me think that you could, especially now, if not like only in this weird world we're in, you can very easily link the need for open space to public health, even though we all talk about it. It's like pretty clear. And so identifying a handful of shovel-ready ideas that are out here in New York City, particularly in those locations that are starved for parks, could be a very compelling use of federal funds.
For sure, for sure.
And with stimulus, the job creation, right, for projects that are
Absolutely.
shovel ready and they could be actually generating jobs in the next couple of years.
Yeah. Solved.
That's what I don't understand is, why they don't want to invest in that part of the economy, in the jobs, in the building infrastructure and stuff. If they've already allocated the funds, say for, 50 Kent and Motiva, like what's holding them up? Why don't they want to, get that, the machine going, with paying, good, strong union jobs, building these parks and stuff. I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, I think I think the city is, it's working, but it's paralyzed. They're focusing on so many critical things right now, and parks, unfortunately, hasn't been one of the things deemed critical, which is, in my mind, ironic. But clearly, there's a need to be pushing the envelope on that discussion.
Katie, we have 3 more minutes. Do you want me to look at the questions in the chat?
Yes, there is a question, and I would invite anyone in the audience to raise your hand if you want to speak. There was a kind of a specific question that came in from Andy McDowell about the acquisition and the cost for city storage. Essentially about the discrepancy and potential misstep of not acquiring it sooner in 2005, if I'm reading it right. If it had been acquired earlier prior to the increase of value in the area, the city could have saved more than $100 million. So can anyone corroborate that claim or question?
Yeah, what Andy is saying is true. And unfortunately, the city somehow didn't anticipate, they didn't plan ahead. They didn't anticipate, I guess, creating such land value so quickly. I think, and yeah, so one of the outcomes of our fight with the Bushwick Inlet Park when broken promises was this broken promises bill that was presented to the council by the public advocate Tish James and the speaker Mark Viverito and Councilman Espinal, saying that in future rezonings there had to be an accountability to promises made. And I was thinking about that today, and I don't know if there's a timeline in it, but they have, and I've gone and I've seen it. It's a whole spreadsheet where if in a rezoning in a neighborhood like East New York, and you're mentioning that, and they promise, you know, this park and this school and stuff like that, that there is a mechanism for tracking that. And that's new, but that happened in 2016. And so, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the only thing I can add about going back in time is that the city, unfortunately, and we didn't discuss this part of the history of Bushwick Inlet either, but it is another important detail is that we spent a huge amount of time fighting the Bayside fuel site redevelopment for electric generation. So the court case for that did drag on. I didn't mention that earlier. And that was another real reality for the city at the time, was how important it was to clear that litigation. And it did go on for quite a while. And it could have added, I really can't respond on the other point, but I just wanted to just remind those who have been around for a while about how much effort that took.
So that was another battle, you know, that was fought before the Bushwick Inlet Park thing was, you know, these power plants and the waste transfer stations that you mentioned and other things.
In this panel series early next year. This is our fall series focusing on actual park projects. And then in the winter, we're going to be looking more at policy issues. And so funding mechanisms is one of those. We are going to be doing a deep dive in, as well as the Open Streets Initiative and air quality issues and environmental justice. So please do tune into that. And unless there are any other final comments, I want to thank all of my panelists for joining us. I really appreciate it. You know, you are all colleagues, and I admire all the work that you've all done on your own projects. I hope that one day Bushwick Inlet Park, like the High Line and Bushwick and Brooklyn Bridge Park, get to that point where the phases are over. But I think we have a long way to go, and it seems like getting the new mayor on board is one of our top priorities. And so we have some work to do, so thank you. And to our audience, thank you as well for joining. I'm pretty sure a lot of you are very interested in open space issues broadly. I might be seeing some of you in about 30 minutes at our next panel about Make Meeker Move, transforming the space under the BQE. So I'll see a couple of you in about a half an hour. And then remember, in December, we're going to be looking at a space above the BQE that doesn't exist yet with our panel discussion on BQGreen on December 8th. So again, thank you all for joining, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.